Unaware his pregnant wife had just inherited the $2.8 trillion estate company he worked for, he pushed her and her elderly mother out into the snow on their anniversary to marry her boss. What she did next shocked him. Marcus Morrison's hands were still warm from the shove as he watched his 7 months pregnant wife Rebecca collapse to her knees in the snow, her screams of, "Please, Marcus, the baby," cutting through the 12-degree blizzard, while his 72-year-old mother Eleanor crumpled beside her, clutching her chest as her heart condition triggered. He slammed the door on their 5th anniversary, deaf to their pounding, certain his pregnant wife had been sleeping with her boss, Richard Sterling, at the $2.8 trillion estate company where Marcus scrubbed toilets and mopped executive floors. But in Rebecca's coat pocket, soaked with snow and her tears, was the inheritance document she'd planned to surprise him with tonight, the one proving she'd just inherited the entire estate company he worked for, making her the owner of every building he'd ever cleaned, every boss who'd ever humiliated him, every dollar he'd ever begged for. The diamond bracelet that convinced Marcus to destroy his pregnant wife wasn't from her boss. It was from the lawyers who just made her the richest woman alive. But when Rebecca pulled herself from that snow, shaking with rage and power and the memory of his hands on her pregnant belly, what she did would shatter Marcus's soul in ways that would make him beg for the mercy he'd denied her. What poison had turned a loving husband into a monster willing to kill his own pregnant wife and elderly mother? What was his mother screaming about the inheritance before her heart gave out in the snow? And when Marcus discovered his pregnant wife now owned his entire existence, would he survive what she unleashed? The apartment fell silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window, a man he barely recognized, chest heaving with righteous anger that felt like drowning. Outside, Rebecca's muffled sobs mixed with Eleanor's gasping pleas, but Marcus turned away, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. On the kitchen counter sat the pot roast his mother had cooked all day, the anniversary cake with its careful icing that read 5 years of forever, and the small wrapped box Rebecca had hidden behind the flour canister, a gift he'd never opened, containing the ultrasound photo showing their daughter's face and the handwritten note that said, "Her name is Hope, just like you gave me." Marcus didn't see any of it. He saw only the diamond bracelet glittering on the table like evidence in a trial where he was both judge and executioner. He'd found it that morning while looking for aspirin in Rebecca's purse, his head pounding from another sleepless night of imagining her in Richard Sterling's arms. The bracelet had to cost $50,000, maybe more, and Marcus made $32,000 a year, scrubbing the floors where men like Sterling walked without ever seeing men like him. 3 hours earlier, Marcus had been repairing a radiator in Sterling's corner office on the 47th floor, the one with views of Central Park that cost more in annual property taxes than Marcus would earn in his lifetime. He'd heard voices and frozen, recognizing Rebecca's laugh, the one she used to give him before her promotion 6 months ago, before the late nights and closed-door meetings and the smell of expensive cologne that wasn't his clinging to her hair. Through the crack in the door, Marcus had watched Richard Sterling, 53 years old, silver-haired, powerful, pull Rebecca into an embrace while she cried into his shoulder. "You're everything to me," Sterling had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the daughter I lost, the future of everything I've built." But Marcus had only heard the first sentence before his heart exploded into shrapnel. He'd left his tools scattered on Sterling's floor and walked out, past the receptionist who tried to stop him, past his supervisor who called his name, past 8 years of loyalty to a company that had never seen him as anything but invisible. His coworker Jerome had found him in the stairwell, hands shaking, and instead of comfort, had offered poison. "Man, I've been trying to tell you for months. Everyone on the executive floor knows. Sterling and your wife. Why you think she got promoted so fast? You think a maintenance guy's wife climbs to vice president on merit?" Jerome's words had felt like confirmation of every fear that had been eating Marcus alive since childhood, since watching his own father walk out the door for a woman with money, since learning that love was just a transaction and he'd never have enough to keep anyone. Now, Marcus stood in the apartment that had been their home for 5 years, surrounded by evidence of a life he'd believed was real. The bookshelf he'd built from reclaimed wood, the photographs of their wedding day when Rebecca had looked at him like he'd hung the moon. The baby clothes they'd bought together, tiny socks and onesies washed and folded and waiting for the daughter due in 8 weeks. His mother's Bible sat open on the coffee table to a passage she'd been trying to show him all evening, something about truth and deception and the danger of pride. but Marcus had been too consumed by rage to listen. Eleanor had known something. He'd seen it in her face when he confronted Rebecca, a flash of panic and desperate urgency that looked like guilt, his own mother siding with the wife who'd betrayed him. The pounding on the door had stopped. Marcus pressed his ear against the wood and heard nothing but wind. Good. Let them go to Sterling's penthouse. Let Rebecca have her rich boss and her expensive jewelry and her corner office life. Marcus would file for divorce tomorrow, would make sure everyone knew what she'd done, would take whatever he could in the settlement, because if she could cheat, he could at least walk away with something. His phone buzzed, a text from his supervisor. You left your tools in Mr. Sterling's office. Very unprofessional. See me first thing tomorrow. Marcus almost laughed. Unprofessional. They had no idea what unprofessional looked like. Wait until he told them about their vice president sleeping with the CEO. Wait until he exposed the whole corrupt system. He didn't know that at that exact moment, Rebecca had managed to pull his mother up from the snow, both of them now stumbling through the blizzard toward the building's lobby where the night doorman was calling 911. He didn't know that Eleanor's lips had turned blue, that her words were slurring, that she kept trying to say Jonathan Cole and inheritance, but the wind ripped the words away. He didn't know that Rebecca's water had broken, warm fluid mixing with freezing snow, or that she was leaving a trail of blood on the white ground as she dragged herself and his mother forward, her vision blurring, her daughter's movements inside her becoming frantic and wrong. Marcus knew none of this because he was staring at the diamond bracelet, picking it up with shaking hands, examining the tiny engraving inside that he hadn't noticed before. It read, To Rebecca Cole Morrison from Chen and Associates, Estate Attorneys, welcome to your inheritance. The words made no sense. Rebecca's maiden name was Parker, not Cole. And why would estate attorneys give her a bracelet? Marcus turned it over, looking for some explanation, and found a business card tucked into the jewelry box he'd been too angry to examine properly. Michael Chen, Senior Partner Chen and Associates, R.E., Estate of Jonathan Cole, deceased. Initial consultation completed. Full transfer of assets pending signature. Total estate value, $2.8 trillion USD. Congratulations, Ms. Morrison. Your father's legacy is now yours. The card slipped from Marcus's fingers. The world tilted sideways. Outside, sirens began to wail, growing closer, and Marcus moved to the window on legs that didn't feel like his own. Down below, in the yellow glow of the building's entrance lights, he saw a cluster of people. Paramedics, the doorman, and two figures on stretchers being loaded into ambulances, one of them visibly pregnant, the other elderly and terrifyingly still. Marcus's phone exploded with notifications. A company-wide email from Sterling Global Properties Board of Directors, time-stamped 11:47 p.m. It is with great emotion that we announce the passing of Jonathan Cole, founder of Cole Enterprises, parent company of Sterling Global Properties. We have also learned that Mr. Cole's previously unknown daughter, our own Vice President Rebecca Morrison, has inherited his entire estate, making her the new owner of Cole Enterprises and all subsidiary companies. Effective immediately, Ms. Morrison is now the majority shareholder and acting CEO. All staff should direct questions to the transition team. We ask for privacy for Ms. Morrison during this difficult time as she grieves her father and assumes this unexpected responsibility. Marcus read it 3 times, then 4. His brain couldn't process the words. Rebecca, inherited, $2.8 trillion owner. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the floor, still buzzing with incoming messages from coworkers, from his supervisor, from Jerome, whose text read, Dude, did you see? Your wife owns the company now? You're married to the richest woman in the world? Man, you're set for life. But Marcus wasn't set for anything except the image burning into his brain of Rebecca on her knees in the snow, screaming for him to stop, screaming about the baby, and him slamming the door anyway. Of his mother's face, gray and twisted with pain, her hand clutching her chest. Of the diamond bracelet that wasn't a gift from a lover, but from lawyers making Rebecca a trillionaire. Of the inheritance documents in her coat pocket, soaked with snow and tears, the surprise she'd planned for their anniversary dinner. Marcus's legs gave out. He crashed to his knees in the same spot where he'd pushed Rebecca just 20 minutes ago, and the sound that came from his throat wasn't human. It was the sound of a man realizing he'd just thrown away everything, his wife, his mother, his daughter, his future, because he'd been too poisoned by pride and fear to ask one simple question. Rebecca, where did this bracelet come from? His phone kept buzzing. Another email, this one from HR. Marcus Morrison, your employment with Sterling Global Properties has been terminated effective immediately for creating a hostile and dangerous situation involving ownership family members. Security has been notified. Do not attempt to enter any Sterling Global Properties buildings. Your final paycheck will be mailed. Marcus stared at the screen. Fired. He'd been fired from the company his wife now owned. The absurdity of it would have been funny if his hands weren't shaking so hard he could barely hold the phone. If he couldn't hear the echo of Rebecca's screams, if the last image of his mother's face wasn't scared into his mind, the way she'd looked at him with disappointment so profound it had aged her another decade in seconds. The emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital was a cathedral of fluorescent lights and desperate prayers, and Rebecca Morrison lay on a gurney in Bay 7 with monitors screaming around her while doctors worked to stop the premature labor that Marcus's hands had triggered. Her body was still shaking from the cold, ice crystals melting in her hair, her hospital gown soaked through with snowmelt and blood and amniotic fluid that shouldn't be leaking yet, not for 8 more weeks, not until her daughter was ready. But hope wasn't ready, and Rebecca's cervix was dilating despite the medications they were pumping into her veins, and the baby's heartbeat on the monitor kept dipping into dangerous territory that made the nurses exchange looks Rebecca had learned to read in the 30 minutes since the ambulance had screamed through red lights to get her here. In the bay next to her, separated only by a thin curtain that did nothing to muffle sound, Eleanor Morrison was coding for the second time, the crash cart's electric charge making the old woman's body jump, while a cardiologist shouted orders and Rebecca heard herself screaming, "Save her! Please save her! She's all he has left!" even though Marcus had just destroyed both of them without hesitation. Richard Sterling burst through the emergency room doors at 12:47 a.m., his silver hair wild from the blizzard, his cashmere coat covered in snow, and the look on his face when he saw Rebecca was every father's nightmare made real. He'd been in his penthouse working on quarterly reports when the doorman had called, frantic, saying Mrs. Morrison and an elderly woman had collapsed in the lobby, saying there was blood in the snow, saying the husband had thrown them out and the night shift had it all on camera. Richard had run 15 blocks through the storm because his driver couldn't navigate the unplowed streets fast enough, his heart pounding with the same terror he'd felt 5 years ago when his own daughter had died, when he'd been too late to say goodbye, too late to protect her from the drunk driver who'd stolen her future. He'd promised himself never again, would never fail another young woman who needed him, and that's what Rebecca had become in the 18 months since he'd started mentoring her, the daughter he'd lost, the second chance he didn't deserve. Now she was broken on a hospital bed because he hadn't protected her from a jealous husband's rage, because he'd been too careful about keeping his sexuality private, too afraid of how it would look if anyone knew how much he cared about his young protégé. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here," Richard whispered, taking Rebecca's hand while the doctor worked between her legs, checking dilation that was progressing too fast despite everything they were trying. Rebecca's eyes found his, and the grief there was bottomless. "He thought we were sleeping together," she said through chattering teeth. "He found the bracelet from the lawyers, and he thought, Richard, he pushed me. He pushed his mother. She's dying, and he pushed us into the snow, and I can't lose hope. I can't lose his baby. Even after what he did, I can't." Her words dissolved into sobs that made the monitors spike, and the doctor bark orders about emotional regulation and stress hormones. But Richard held her hand tighter and let her cry because he understood that some grief was too big for medical protocols. Behind the curtain, Eleanor's monitor flatlined again, and this time the silence afterward stretched longer than before, and Rebecca heard the cardiologist say, "Call it," and the nurse say, "Time of death, 12:52 a.m., and Rebecca screamed so loud that security came running, thinking someone was being murdered, not understanding that someone was, that the gentle old woman who'd baked anniversary cakes and prayed for her son's marriage had just been killed by her own child's cruelty. Marcus arrived at the hospital at 1:15 a.m., having run 12 blocks through the blizzard after the ambulances, his lungs burning from cold air and panic, his mind still trying to process the impossible truth that his wife owned everything and he'd just destroyed it all. But when he burst through the emergency room doors, wild-eyed and desperate, hospital security was waiting, because Richard Sterling had made calls, had used the power that came with being CEO of a subsidiary company owned by the woman bleeding in Bay 7, had ensured that the man who'd nearly killed that woman wouldn't get within 100 feet of her. 2 guards grabbed Marcus's arms while he fought, screaming Rebecca's name. screaming that he was her husband, that he had rights, that this was all a misunderstanding. He couldn't see past the security desk to where Rebecca lay, couldn't know that she could hear his voice and was curling into herself like his words were blows, couldn't see Richard standing like a sentinel between the waiting room and the treatment area, his face carved from stone and grief. "Your mother died 17 minutes ago," Richard said, his voice carrying across the emergency room with devastating clarity. "Heart attack triggered by exposure and stress, and your wife is in premature labor because you pushed a 7 months pregnant woman into a blizzard. So no, Marcus Morrison, you don't get to see her. You don't get to apologize. You don't get anything except the knowledge that you murdered your own mother and might murder your daughter too, all because you were too insecure to ask your wife one honest question." The security guards were dragging Marcus backwards now, his legs giving out, his screams turning into something animal and broken. But Richard wasn't finished. "She was going to tell you tonight," he said, and every person in that emergency room was listening now. Nurses and doctors and other patients' families bearing witness to a tragedy unfolding in real time. About the inheritance, about her father, about quitting her job to focus on your family. She'd planned the whole evening. She was going to make you a billionaire by breakfast, Marcus. But you chose pride over trust, and now your mother is dead, and your daughter might die too, and your wife owns the company that just fired you, owns the building you'll be evicted from, owns every single thing you ever thought made you a man." Richard's voice cracked on the last word. "And the worst part? She still loves you. Even now, after everything, she's in there crying for you while fighting to save your child. So you tell me, Marcus Morrison, was your jealousy worth it? Was your pride worth murdering your own mother and destroying the only woman who ever saw you as enough?" The guards hauled Marcus out into the snow, and the last thing he saw before the emergency room doors closed was Richard Sterling turning his back, walking away toward the woman Marcus had sworn to love and protect, the woman who now owned Marcus's entire existence and had every right to destroy him, but was instead fighting to save the daughter they'd made together. Marcus collapsed on the sidewalk outside, the blizzard burying him in white, and he understood with perfect clarity that this was his grave. Not physical death, but something worse, the death of everything he'd been and everything he'd ever have, all because he'd let poison whisper in his ear instead of trusting the woman who'd loved him when he'd had nothing at all. Rebecca Morrison gave birth to Hope Eleanor Morrison at 3:47 a.m. in an operating room that smelled like disinfectant and desperation, the baby arriving 10 weeks early at 3 pounds and 12 ounces, her lungs underdeveloped, and her cry more like a kitten's mew than the robust wail Rebecca had imagined during 9 months of dreaming. They whisked Hope away to the NICU before Rebecca could hold her, before she could count fingers and toes and whisper all the promises she'd been saving. And Rebecca lay on the surgical table with her arms empty and her heart shattered, knowing that Marcus's hands had done this, that his jealousy had stolen these crucial weeks from their daughter's development. Richard stood beside her the entire time, holding her hand through the epidural and the pushing and the terrifying moment when Hope came out silent and blue before finally gasping her way into a world that had almost killed her. When it was over and Rebecca was being wheeled to recovery, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the ambulances. "Is Marcus still here?" The nurse hesitated, looking to Richard for guidance, and Richard's face told Rebecca everything. "He's been outside for 4 hours, Richard said quietly. "Security won't let him in, but he won't leave. He's just sitting in the snow, Rebecca. I think he's trying to die." The words should have made Rebecca feel satisfied, should have felt like justice for what Marcus had done to her and Eleanor and Hope. But instead, they felt like another ending, another death to add to the night's brutal toll. She'd loved Marcus Morrison for 5 years, had chosen him over every wealthy suitor her secret family connections could have provided, had believed in the goodness she'd seen in his eyes when he'd defended a homeless man being thrown out of the building by security, when he'd spent his lunch breaks teaching immigrant workers English, when he'd cried at their wedding, because he couldn't believe someone like her would choose someone like him. That man was still in there somewhere beneath the jealousy and fear, and Rebecca had to decide if he was worth excavating or if some betrayals cut too deep for love to heal. She thought about Eleanor, who'd died clutching her chest and calling Marcus's name, who'd spent her last moments not cursing her son, but trying to save him from his own mistakes. She thought about Hope, fighting for every breath in an incubator, because her father's hands had pushed her into the world too soon, and she thought about the $2.8 trillion inheritance sitting in accounts she'd never asked for, power she'd never wanted, a father's guilty legacy that had somehow arrived at the exact moment to save her from the streets but couldn't save her from heartbreak. At 6:23 a.m., as dawn broke gray and cold over New York, Rebecca made her decision. She had Richard bring Marcus to her hospital room. But with conditions: security would remain outside the door, Richard would stay by her side, and Marcus would have exactly 10 minutes to explain why she shouldn't use her new power to erase him from existence. When Marcus walked in, Rebecca almost didn't recognize him. His face was ravaged, eyes red and swollen from crying, lips blue from hours in the freezing cold, his whole body shaking with hypothermia and grief. He fell to his knees beside her bed without being asked, his hands reaching for her before stopping midair as if he'd forgotten he'd lost the right to touch her. "I killed my mother," Marcus whispered, his voice destroyed. "I killed her, Rebecca. She died calling my name, and I killed her because I was too proud, too scared, too stupid to see that you were never the problem. I was. My father left us for a rich woman when I was 7, and I've spent every day since then waiting for you to do the same, looking for evidence that you'd leave, needing to find it before you could hurt me first. And when I saw that bracelet, when I heard Richard say you were everything to him, my fear won. I let it win, and now my mother is dead, and our daughter might die. And you should hate me, Rebecca. You should destroy me. I deserve it." Rebecca looked at the man she'd married, the man who'd just confessed to the poisonous fear that had murdered their family, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness. It was too soon for that, maybe too soon forever, but understanding. She'd chosen Marcus because he was different from the wealthy, entitled men in her secret father's world, but she'd never understood that poverty leaves scars as deep as any childhood trauma, that watching your parents struggle creates wounds that make you see betrayal in every shadow. "Hope is alive," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 3 pounds, 12 ounces. She's fighting. And your mother's last words were about you, Marcus, not cursing you, trying to tell me about the inheritance, trying to save our marriage even as her heart was failing. She paused, letting him absorb the weight of Eleanor's final act of love. "I'm going to tell you what happens next, and you're going to accept it, because you have no choice. You're going to get therapy for your abandonment trauma. You're going to spend every day earning back trust you may never fully regain. You're going to be the father Hope deserves, not the scared boy whose father left. And if you ever let fear make you cruel again, I will use every dollar of this inheritance to make sure you never see us again. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, sobs racking his body, and Rebecca let him cry because some lessons require complete breaking before rebuilding can start. She didn't know if their marriage would survive this, didn't know if love could overcome the trauma of his hands pushing her pregnant body into deadly cold. But she knew Eleanor would have wanted her to try, knew Hope deserved a father who could heal, knew that sometimes the hardest form of strength isn't revenge, but the terrifying vulnerability of offering one more chance. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to something harder. "Jerome Martinez, your coworker who's been feeding your jealousy for 6 months, I had Richard pull his employee file. He's been stealing from the company and blamed it on other maintenance staff. He wanted you paranoid and distracted so you wouldn't notice him. He helped destroy our family for his own gain, Marcus. What should I do with him?" Marcus looked up, understanding dawning that his wife now had the power to exact justice for all of them, and the answer he gave would tell Rebecca everything about whether he'd learned anything from this nightmare. His response would determine not just Jerome's fate, but whether Marcus Morrison could evolve from the man who'd pushed his pregnant wife into the snow into someone worthy of the second chance she was offering. Outside, dawn was breaking over a city buried in snow, and in the NICU 3 floors up, Hope Eleanor Morrison fought for each breath, her tiny chest rising and falling. With determination she'd inherited from a mother who'd survived the unsurvivable, and a father who'd just been given the chance to become the man he should have been all along. Whether he'd take it remained the question that would haunt them all. "So tell me, where are you watching this from, and what time is it in your world? Drop your location and the time in the comments below, because I want to know where this story found you. And if you made it this far, if Rebecca and Marcus and Hope's story touched something in you, hit that notification bell right now so you never miss what happens next. Because trust me, this is only the beginning of a journey that will break you and rebuild you in ways you never saw coming. Turn on all notifications. This story isn't over, not by a long shot.